The abandoned alien. The planet was silent. The wind howled through the ruins, carrying the scent of dust and decay. The sky was dark, with thick, swirling clouds hiding the stars. There was no life, no voices, no hope. Zira sat in the shadow of a broken building, her body curled tightly as she shivered in the cold night air. She had nothing left. No food, no shelter, and no one to call her own. Her people were gone, taken by war or destroyed by the merciless sky-fire that had burned everything to the ground. She should have died with them, but she hadn't. Now she was alone. Her skin, a pale shade of silver, had lost its usual glow. Her long, dark hair was tangled, her clothes torn. She hugged herself, listening to the distant sounds of night creatures moving through the ruins. They were hungry, just like her. She had been hiding for days, maybe weeks. Time had no meaning anymore. Then she saw him. At first, Zira thought her mind was playing tricks on her. A figure moved in the distance, stepping over broken stones and shattered metal. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and walked with confidence, as if he did not fear the creatures that lurked in the dark. A human. She had only heard of them before. Strong, stubborn, dangerous. Her people had whispered stories about them. Warriors from distant worlds, survivors who never gave up, even when everything was against them. What was a human doing here? Zira pressed herself against the cold stone, barely breathing as she watched him. He was alone. He carried a heavy pack on his back, and in his hands he held strange tools. Instead of weapons, he had wood and metal. She narrowed her eyes. What was he building? She watched as he found an open space between two half-destroyed buildings. He dropped his pack and started working. With strong, steady hands, he placed wooden beams in the ground, hammering them deep into the dirt. He moved with purpose, never hesitating. Zira didn't understand. Why build something here? Why not leave, like everyone else? She stayed hidden, but curiosity kept her watching. As the sun set, the human lit a small fire. The glow flickered against his face, revealing sharp features and tired eyes. He pulled out a small metal container, opened it, and began eating something. The smell drifted toward Zira, making her stomach twist with hunger. She hadn't eaten in days. The human suddenly looked up. Zira froze. His eyes scanned the darkness. Had he seen her? Heard her? She held her breath, pressing herself further into the shadows. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he reached into his bag and pulled out something small, a piece of food. He didn't throw it. He didn't speak. He just placed it on a nearby rock, stood up, and walked away, back to his fire. Zira's heart pounded. Was it a trick? A trap? Humans were not known for kindness, not in the stories she had heard. But this one had done nothing to hurt her. She stared at the food. Her stomach ached. She needed it. Carefully, she crawled forward, her movements slow and silent. The human didn't look up. He continued working near his fire, adjusting the beams he had placed. Zira snatched the food and ran back into the shadows. She expected him to react, to chase her, to say something. But he didn't. He only continued his work. Zira ate in silence, her eyes never leaving the strange human who had given her food without asking for anything in return. The night grew colder, and the ruins around her felt even darker. But for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel completely alone. She watched the human until sleep finally pulled her into the darkness. Somewhere deep inside, a small thought whispered in her mind. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the only survivor after all. The human's kindness. Zira woke before the sun rose. The sky was a deep shade of purple, the stars slowly fading as dawn approached. Her body ached from sleeping on the hard ground, but she ignored the pain. Her eyes focused on one thing, the human. He was already awake. She watched from her hiding place as he moved around the small area he had claimed as his own. His fire had burned low, but thin trails of smoke still rose from the embers. His movements were steady, controlled, as if he had done this 100 times before. Zira didn't understand him. She had seen many creatures fight to survive, but never like this. Never with creation instead of destruction. Humans were supposed to be warriors, conquerors, takers. But this one, he was building. She stayed hidden, unsure if she should watch or run. Then she saw something that made her breath catch. The human turned and looked directly at her hiding spot. Her heart pounded. Had he known she was watching him all along? Had he been pretending not to notice her? She tensed, ready to run. But the human didn't move toward her. Instead, he reached into his bag and pulled out something. Food. Just like last night. Slowly, he walked toward a flat rock near the ruins and placed it there. Then, without a word, he stepped back, giving her space. Zira didn't move. She studied his face. His expression was calm, unreadable. He wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't angry. Why was he doing this? She hesitated, torn between hunger and suspicion. But the hunger was stronger. Keeping her eyes on him, she moved forward, her footsteps light on the dusty ground. The human didn't react, didn't speak. He only watched. Zira grabbed the food and backed away quickly, retreating into the shadows. Still, he said nothing. She expected him to try something, to follow her, to set a trap. But instead, he simply turned and went back to his work. Zira narrowed her eyes. What kind of human was this? The shelter begins. As the day passed, Zira continued watching. The human, Ethan, worked tirelessly. She listened as he muttered to himself, though she couldn't understand all his words. His voice was deep, rough, but not unpleasant. He was building something. A shelter. A real one, not just a temporary cover like she had used. Wood and metal, placed carefully, piece by piece. He reinforced it with whatever he could find. His hands were strong, yet his movements were precise. Zira frowned. Why build? Why stay? The planet was dead. Nothing remained but ruins and the dangers that lurked at night. She should have left already, but she didn't. Something about Ethan kept her there. The first words. By the time the sun began to set, Ethan had made progress. The frame of his shelter was complete, and he had started reinforcing the walls. He worked without rest, as if time was running out. Zira, still hidden in the ruins, felt an unfamiliar emotion creep into her chest. Guilt. He had given her food twice. He had left her alone. He had done nothing to harm her, yet she had done nothing in return. Her people had taught her to repay kindness, no matter how small. Even if she didn't trust him, she couldn't ignore what he had done. Taking a slow breath, Zira stepped out of the shadows. Ethan was stacking the heavy metal sheet against the side of the shelter when he noticed her. He froze for a second, then straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. They stood there, facing each other. For the first time, Zira spoke. Her voice was rough from disuse, her words hesitant. Why? Ethan tilted his head. Why what? She swallowed. Why? Help me. He considered her for a moment, then shrugged. Seemed like you needed it. Zira frowned. That made no sense. Humans didn't do things without reason. She looked at the shelter, then back at him. You stay. Ethan nodded. Yeah. Zira hesitated. Why? This time, Ethan's expression changed. A shadow passed over his face, something heavy behind his eyes. Nowhere else to go, he said simply. Zira understood that feeling all too well. A silent agreement. The wind picked up as night fell. The ruins grew colder, the distant howls of night creatures echoing through the empty city. Zira took a step back, but she didn't return to her usual hiding spot. Instead, she stayed closer. Not inside the shelter, not near him, but close enough to feel the faint warmth of the fire he had built. Ethan didn't comment. He simply tossed another piece of wood into the flames and sat down. For the first time in weeks, Zira didn't sleep alone. She didn't trust him, not fully, but something had changed. The planet was still empty. The ruins were still silent. But for the first time since she had been left behind, she didn't feel completely abandoned. Survival together. The nights on the ruined planet were long and cruel. The cold bit deep, creeping into bones and stealing warmth. The silence was worse. It was the kind that made the mind restless, where every distant sound felt like an approaching threat. Zira had spent weeks surviving in this silence, curled in the shadows, waiting for something, anything, to change. Now something had. A human had arrived. A human who built instead of destroyed. A human who shared his food without asking for anything in return. A human who didn't leave. She didn't understand him. Not yet. But she was starting to. Morning light, unspoken words. Zira woke to the smell of burning wood. It was different from the usual scent of destruction. This fire was controlled, warm. She opened her eyes and saw Ethan sitting near the flames, sharpening a piece of metal into something useful. He glanced at her. "You gonna stay in the dirt all day?" She blinked, still waking up. The words didn't fully make sense, but his tone was light, almost amused. She sat up slowly, watching him. Ethan sighed, setting the metal down. "You don't talk much, huh?" Zira hesitated. "No need." He chuckled. "Fair enough." She studied him as he worked. His hands were rough, his arms lined with small scars. He wasn't a warrior, but he had seen hardship. He looked like someone who had built 1,000 things and watched half of them fall apart. But he still built. Zira tilted her head. "Why do you make shelter?" Ethan kept his focus on the piece of metal in his hands. "Same reason you hide. To survive." Zira frowned. "You do not hide." "Don't need to." He gave her a sideways glance. "Not anymore. At least." She didn't understand. Not yet, but she would. A test of trust. Ethan stood, stretching his arms before grabbing a few supplies. "I need more materials. If I don't get a roof up soon, we're both gonna be soaking wet when the next storm hits." Zira tensed. "We're both." He wasn't just building for himself. She should have expected it. The way he left food for her, the way he never pushed her away, the way he accepted her presence like it was natural. But hearing it was different. Ethan didn't wait for a response. He adjusted the strap on his pack and started walking toward the ruins. He wasn't armed, not properly anyway. He carried a long metal rod, sharp at the end, but it wasn't enough against the creatures that roamed at night. Zira frowned. If something attacked, he wouldn't survive. Without thinking, she stood and followed. Ethan glanced back. He didn't look surprised. Decided to help. Zira didn't answer. She just walked. Scavengers of the ruins. The ruins stretched for miles. Crumbling buildings stood like broken bones, hollow and lifeless. Once they had been full of people, of movement, of voices. Now only the wind moved through them. Ethan scanned the area, searching for anything useful. "Need strong panels, stuff that'll hold in place. If we find old wiring, that's a bonus." Zira nodded slightly. She understood the materials he meant. They moved carefully. The ruins weren't safe. Sharp metal jutted out from collapsed walls. Unstable ground threatened to break under their feet. And of course, the creatures. Zira had seen them before. The stalkers. They didn't move in daylight, but their scent lingered. If night fell before they returned, it would be over. Ethan didn't seem worried. He worked fast, pulling apart old structures, tossing aside anything useless. Zira moved with more grace, finding what he missed. It was easy. For the first time in weeks, she was doing something that wasn't just about waiting to die. Hours passed. Their pile of supplies grew. Then Zira heard it. A soft shuffle. A scrape of claws against stone. Her body went rigid. Ethan noticed her change in posture immediately. "What is it?" She didn't answer. She just listened. Then, a low growl. Zira grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him back just as something lunged from the shadows. The first battle. The creature was fast, too fast. It slammed into the ground where Ethan had stood seconds ago, snarling. Its body was long and sleek, with black, oily skin that shimmered in the dim light. Its mouth was full of jagged teeth, eyes glowing like dying embers. A stalker. Zira knew how they hunted. They didn't fight alone. Another growl echoed through the ruins. More were coming. Ethan lifted his weapon, eyes narrowing. "Tell me you've got a plan." Zira reached into her tattered clothing and pulled out something small. A shock blade. A single strike wouldn't kill a stalker, but it would slow them. She shifted into a low stance. Run or fight. Ethan grinned. "Oh, I'm not running." The stalker lunged. Zira moved first. She ducked under the attack, spinning her blade forward, slicing across the creature's side. It let out a sharp screech but didn't fall. Ethan took his chance, swinging his metal rod straight into its skull. The sound of cracking bone echoed through the ruins. The stalker collapsed, twitching. But the others were already here. Ethan glanced at Zira. "All right, now we run." She didn't argue. They grabbed what they could and sprinted back toward the shelter, returning to the fire. By the time they reached the shelter, the sun was sinking below the horizon. Their breath came in sharp bursts, their bodies aching from the chase. They had lost the stalkers, for now. Ethan dropped the supplies, running a hand through his hair. "Well, that was fun." Zira shot him a look. "You are strange." He laughed. "Yeah. I get that a lot." She looked at the shelter. It wasn't finished yet, but it was stronger than before. They had made it stronger. Ethan sat by the fire, stretching out his sore muscles. Zira hesitated before slowly sitting across from him. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. For the first time, they had fought together. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. And for the first time, she realized she wasn't alone. The threat from above. The night was restless. Zira lay awake near the fire, her body still tense from the earlier fight with the stalkers. Her wounds were minor, just scratches, but her mind was uneasy. The ruins were dangerous, but they were predictable. The stalkers followed their patterns, hunting at night, retreating by dawn. She could survive them. What worried her now was the sky. Ethan, unaware of her thoughts, slept soundly against the half-built shelter. His breathing was steady, his body relaxed despite everything. He had fought well. Not perfect, not with skill, but with determination. That mattered more than anything. Zira pulled her knees to her chest, her sharp silver eyes drifting upward. The sky was no longer empty. A ship had arrived. A shadow in the sky. The vessel was silent, hovering just above the ruins, its dark metallic frame blending with the night. It had appeared just before dusk, too far to see clearly, but she knew what it was. Not a rescue, not a merchant ship, a hunter. Zira had seen such ships before. Her people had feared them. They didn't belong to humans, nor to her kind, but to something worse, the scavengers. Mercenaries. Raiders. Those who profited from war's destruction. And now, they were here. Ethan stirred beside the fire, mumbling something in his sleep. Zira glanced at him, debating whether to wake him. The ship wasn't close yet, but it would be soon. Her mind raced. Had it detected them? She doubted it. They were small, insignificant. To raiders, survivors weren't worth much unless they were profitable. But if they were found, Ethan would be captured, maybe killed. And she knew what scavengers did to her kind. Zira's fingers curled into fists. She wouldn't let it happen. Not again. The morning decision. The sky lightened as the sun crept over the horizon. Ethan woke with a groggy groan, stretching his arms before rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He looked at Zira, who was still sitting up, watching the sky. "You sleep at all?" he asked. She didn't answer. Instead, She nodded toward the sky. Look. Ethan followed her gaze and froze. The ship was still there, distant but closer than before. His expression darkened, all traces of sleep vanishing in an instant. Shit. Zira studied him carefully. She expected panic, but he didn't seem surprised. He looked angry. You know this ship? She asked. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his messy brown hair. Not this one specifically, but yeah, I know the type. Zira narrowed her eyes. Scavengers. Ethan nodded grimly. They don't leave anything behind. People, supplies, tech. If it's valuable, they take it. She studied him. They took something from you. Ethan was silent for a moment. Then he shook his head. Not something. Someone. Zira understood that pain all too well. She didn't ask for details. Instead, she focused on the situation. They will search soon. Ethan exhaled slowly. Then we need to move. The hunt begins. They worked fast. Ethan packed whatever supplies he could carry. Zira dismantled parts of the shelter, erasing any obvious signs that they had been there. The fire was put out, the footprints in the dirt covered. By the time the ship's engines roared overhead, they were already gone. They'd moved through the ruins, sticking to the shadows, avoiding open spaces. Zira led the way. Her people had been skilled in evasion. She knew how to disappear. Ethan, however, was not so quiet. His boots crunched against loose gravel. His breathing was heavier than hers. He was a builder, not a ghost. She turned and placed a hand on his chest, signaling him to stop. He frowned. What? She pointed toward the street ahead. Two figures stood there, dressed in mismatched armor, carrying weapons far too advanced for simple survivors. Scavengers. They were already searching. Ethan's jaw clenched. His fingers tightened around the makeshift spear he had made days ago. Zira grabbed his wrist before he could do something reckless. No, she whispered. Ethan looked at her, his expression hard. They'll find us anyway. Zira shook her head. Not if we move now. He exhaled sharply, but nodded. They slipped back into the ruins, staying low, staying quiet. The scavengers were scanning the wreckage, their voices distorted through mechanical helmets. Then one of them spoke. Traces detected. Organic signatures. 2, maybe 3. Zira's stomach twisted. They knew. The escape plan. Ethan and Zira moved fast, cutting through the ruins like shadows. The scavengers weren't far behind. They would track them, follow the heat signatures left behind. Running wasn't enough. They needed a plan. Zira whispered, We split. I lead them away. Ethan immediately shook his head. No way. You are slower. You will be caught. And you won't. She hesitated. She could escape, but she didn't know if she'd make it back. Ethan must have seen the doubt on her face because he sighed, glancing around. Then, suddenly, he smirked. I've got a better idea. Zira raised an eyebrow. You do. Ethan grabbed a nearby metal pipe and banged it hard against a collapsed wall. The sound echoed through the ruins, loud and unnatural. The scavengers turned toward the noise instantly. Then the ground rumbled. From the deep, dark corners of the ruins, something stirred. Zira's eyes widened. You just woke up the stalkers. Ethan grinned. Yeah. And now we run. The first screech rang through the air. The scavengers turned as several black shapes emerged from the rubble, their glowing eyes locking onto the new intruders. Chaos exploded. Zira and Ethan didn't wait. They ran, disappearing into the ruins as the scavengers found themselves face to face with a pack of hungry, enraged stalkers. Gunfire erupted. Screams followed. Zira glanced at Ethan as they ran. You are insane. Ethan laughed breathlessly. Yeah, but it worked, didn't it? She couldn't argue. The temporary victory. By the time they stopped running, the sounds of battle had faded into the distance. Zira leaned against a broken pillar, catching her breath. Ethan flopped down beside her, exhausted but grinning. "We made it," he said. "For now," Zira muttered. The scavengers weren't gone. They would come back, and next time, they would be more careful. But for tonight, they had won. Ethan looked at her, his smile fading slightly. "You were really gonna split up, huh?" She didn't answer. But she didn't need to. Ethan sighed. "Well, don't do that again." Zira narrowed her eyes. "I do not take orders." He smirked. "Yeah. Well, neither do I." For the first time in a long time, Zira let out a small, quiet laugh. For now, they had survived together. Tomorrow would be another fight. A home built from nothing. The ruins were quiet again. Not because the danger was gone, it never truly left, but because Ethan and Zira had survived the night. That was enough. For now. Zira sat by the half-built shelter, watching Ethan work. His hands were steady as he tied together pieces of salvaged metal and wood, reinforcing the frame. He had no advanced tools, no machines, nothing but his own 2 hands, some rope, and an iron determination to build something that would last. Zira didn't understand humans. They were stubborn, reckless, loud, and often foolish. But they didn't give up. Even when the world around them crumbled, even when survival seemed impossible, they built. And Ethan, he was the strangest human she had ever met. The first steps toward a home. The sun was high in the sky, but it gave little warmth. The air remained cold, and the winds carried the distant echoes of creatures lurking in the ruins. Zira stood and walked over to Ethan, watching as he secured another piece of the structure. "You are wasting time," she said. Ethan smirked without looking up. "You've been saying that since I started." She crossed her arms. "Because it is true." He wiped sweat from his forehead. "Look, I get it. You think it's pointless. But I need shelter, and so do you." Zira frowned. "I survived without it." Ethan finally looked at her, his eyes calm but firm. "Surviving isn't the same as living." Zira opened her mouth to argue but stopped. She didn't have an answer to that. Ethan turned back to his work, hammering a metal sheet into place. "You don't have to help, but if you're gonna stand there judging me, at least pass me that rope." Zira hesitated, then reached for the rope beside her. Without thinking, she handed it to him. Ethan took it without a word, tying it around the frame to secure it. Something unspoken passed between them. Zira had survived on this planet for weeks, avoiding everything and everyone. Now she was helping build something. Not just a shelter. A home. A lesson in strength. Hours passed. The shelter took shape, walls reinforced, a roof partially in place. It was far from complete, but it felt real now. Ethan took a step back, hands on his hips. Not bad for a guy working with scraps. Zira studied it, tilting her head. It wasn't the grand structures of her old world, nor the towering ships of human design, but it was something solid in a broken place. Ethan sat down on the ground, stretching his sore muscles. "All right, my turn to ask something." Zira raised an eyebrow. "Ask what?" Ethan gestured toward her. "You're fast. Strong. You handled that stalker like it was nothing. Where'd you learn to fight?" Zira's expression darkened. She turned her gaze to the sky. "I did not learn. I was made this way." Ethan frowned. "Made?" She hesitated, then sighed. "My people, we are different. Our bodies heal faster. We move quicker. We sense danger before it arrives." She glanced at him. "Humans do not." Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, we're fragile, but we make up for it with sheer stupidity and persistence." Zira gave him a small, rare smirk. "That is true." Ethan leaned back on his elbows. "So what happened to your people?" Zira stiffened. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, she whispered, "They left me." Ethan didn't press. He just nodded slowly. "That sucks." Zira blinked. Humans had a way of speaking that was so simple, yet full of meaning. She had expected pity, questions, maybe even disbelief. But he only accepted her words. And somehow, that made it easier. A storm on the horizon. The wind changed. Zira lifted her head, her sharp senses picking up the shift before Ethan even noticed. Something was coming. Not scavengers. Not stalkers. A storm. The sky darkened, thick clouds rolling over the horizon like a slow-moving beast. Electricity crackled in the air, and the temperature dropped. Ethan sat up, noticing the change. That doesn't look good. Zura's voice was firm. We need to finish the shelter. Now. Ethan didn't argue. They worked fast, securing the last few weak points. The wind picked up speed, howling through the ruins. Dust and debris swirled around them as the sky turned a deep shade of violet. By the time the first heavy raindrops fell, they had reinforced the walls. Ethan pulled Zira inside just as the storm hit. A shelter against the chaos. Rain hammered against the metal roof, wind screeching through the cracks in the structure. The entire world outside had turned into chaos. Inside, it was not perfect, but safe. Ethan sat against the wall, exhaling. Well, that was close. Zira sat across from him, arms wrapped around her knees. It will last the night. Ethan smiled. Damn right it will. We built this thing with our own hands. She looked at him. We. She had never been a we before. For so long she had been alone, drifting through the ruins like a ghost. But now, she wasn't alone anymore. Zira rested her head back against the wall. The storm raged outside, but she felt something strange in her chest. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The meaning of home. The night passed. By morning, the storm was gone, leaving the world washed clean. The sky was clear again, the sun rising over the broken landscape. Ethan stretched, yawning. Well, the place didn't fall apart. That's a good sign. Zira stood, stepping outside. The air was fresh, the scent of wet earth filling her lungs. She looked at the shelter, their shelter. It was rough, imperfect, but it stood. She turned back to Ethan. You were right. Ethan blinked. About what? Zira hesitated, then said, surviving is not the same as living. Ethan grinned. Damn, did I just win an argument? She rolled her eyes, but there was no bitterness. Only something lighter. For the first time in a long time, she had something more than just survival. She had a home. And maybe, just maybe, she had a friend too. The final decision. The ruins had changed. Not in shape, not in the broken buildings or the endless stretches of dust and silence. That remained the same, but something felt different. Zira could not explain it. Perhaps it was the small, imperfect shelter standing where there had once been nothing but wreckage. Perhaps it was the warmth of a fire that now burned at night, no longer just for survival, but for comfort. Or perhaps it was the human sitting beside her, laughing as he carved a useless shape into a piece of wood with a dull knife. The old Zira would not have cared, would not have stayed. Yet here she was. She wasn't sure if that was a good thing. A message from the sky. The morning was quiet. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and cold. Zira sat outside the shelter, watching the horizon. Then she heard it. A faint beeping. Soft, distant. Her entire body went rigid. Ethan, inside the shelter, didn't notice right away. He was busy adjusting the walls, muttering something about reinforcing the structure. Zira stood, listening carefully. The sound was faint but real. It came from the east, past the ruins, near the old transmission towers. A signal. A distress beacon. She felt her breath catch in her throat. Someone had sent it. Ethan finally noticed her stillness. Hey, you okay? Zira didn't answer. Instead, she turned toward him, eyes sharp. There is a signal. Ethan frowned. A signal. She pointed toward the distant ruins. A distress beacon. Someone activated it. Ethan's expression shifted. Could be a trap. Zira nodded. Or it could be rescue. Silence stretched between them. Ethan exhaled. So, what do we do? The weight of choice. For hours, they debated. Ethan was cautious. He knew scavengers were still out there. If the beacon belonged to them, approaching it meant death. Zira, however, could not ignore it. If someone had activated the beacon, they were in trouble. They might be like her, lost, abandoned, left to die. And more than that, if a real rescue ship was coming, it was her only chance to leave. Ethan must have sensed her thoughts because he grew quiet. He stared at the fire, expression unreadable. Then he finally asked, "Do you want to leave?" The question hit harder than she expected. She should have said yes. This planet was nothing but ruins and death. There was no future here, no place for her. But when she opened her mouth, no words came out. Zira looked at the shelter. The walls weren't strong, the roof was barely holding, but it was theirs. She looked at Ethan. He was human, strange, foolish, loud. But he had stayed. And she realized something terrifying. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to leave. The journey to the signal. Despite the doubts, the decision was made. They would investigate the beacon. If it was real, Zira would have to choose, stay or leave. If it was a trap, they would fight. Ethan packed what little supplies they had. Zira checked her shock blade, making sure it still worked. She had no gun, no armor, nothing that could protect her if things went wrong. They moved through the ruins, staying low. The walk was long, stretching through areas they had never dared explore before. The deeper they went, the worse the wreckage became. Burned-out ships, skeletons of old buildings, the scars of war that had wiped out everything. Ethan muttered, "Place looks worse than I remember." Zira glanced at him. "You have been here before." He hesitated. "A long time ago. Before everything went to hell." Zira wanted to ask more, but she sensed the pain in his voice. So she didn't press. They reached the beacon just as the sun began to set. And what they found changed everything. The truth behind the signal. The beacon sat in the middle of an old crash site. Pieces of metal were scattered everywhere, the remains of a small escape pod buried beneath the wreckage. Zira approached cautiously. Ethan stayed behind, gripping his makeshift spear. The beacon was still active. And then she saw the body. Not human. One of her kind. Zira's breath caught. She dropped to her knees beside the body, heart pounding. The alien was older, his silver skin dulled with age, his armor torn. He had been trying to send a message before he died. Zira reached out and touched the small transmitter still clutched in his hand. The moment her fingers pressed against it, a hologram flickered to life. A weak, distorted voice spoke. "Survivors, if you hear this, we are returning. Hold on. Do not lose hope." The message ended. The beacon went dark. Silence. Then Ethan spoke, his voice low. "Zira, what does this mean?" Her hands clenched into fists. It meant her people were coming back. It meant she had a way off this planet. It meant she had a choice. Go back to her kind, or stay with the human who had given her a home. She stared at the ruined escape pod, her heart twisting. For so long, she had believed she was the last of her kind. Now that was no longer true. But was that enough to make her leave? She didn't know. And that terrified her. The final night. They returned to the shelter in silence. Ethan didn't ask any more questions. He simply sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Zira sat across from him, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "So, you're leaving?" Zira hesitated. "I don't know." Ethan nodded slowly. He didn't try to convince her to stay. He didn't say anything about how much they had built, how much they had survived together. He just said, "Whatever you choose, I get it." Zira swallowed. "And you?" Ethan shrugged. I'll be fine. A lie. She could see it in his eyes. But she also knew he wouldn't ask her to stay. That was the kind of man he was. The decision. Morning came. Zira stood at the edge of the shelter, staring at the horizon. She could wait for the signal to be picked up, hope her people would find her. Or she could turn back, to the small, unfinished home Ethan had built with his own hands. Her heart raced. She had never had a choice before. Now she did. And she had to decide. The true meaning of home. The wind carried the scent of dust and morning air as Zira stood at the edge of the ruins, staring at the endless horizon. The sky was clearer today, streaked with soft pinks and blues, as if the planet itself was waiting for her choice. Behind her, the small shelter stood, a rough, unfinished thing made of scavenged metal and stubborn determination. Inside, Ethan sat by the fire, silent, waiting for her to decide. The distress beacon's message echoed in her mind. Survivors, if you hear this, we are returning. Hold on. Do not lose hope. Her people were coming back. She had a way out. But for the first time in her life, Zira wasn't sure if she wanted to take it. A life left behind. She had always imagined this moment, finding a way home, reuniting with what was left of her kind. Yet now, standing here, she realized something painful. She didn't know what home was anymore. The life she once had was gone. Her people had left her behind. Even if they returned, would she still belong with them? Would they welcome her? Or would she always be an outsider, trapped between the past and the present? She clenched her fists. Zira had spent so long surviving, running from death, from loneliness, from the memories of everything she had lost. But here, with Ethan, she had built something. Not just a shelter. Something real. The human who stayed. Ethan hadn't tried to convince her to stay. That was what made this harder. Most people would have tried, would have begged, would have reminded her of everything they had been through, how much they had fought together, built together. But Ethan, he had never asked for anything. He had given her food when she was starving. He had shared his fire when she was freezing. He had built a home, piece by piece, not just for himself, but for her too. And now, when she had a choice to leave, he simply let her decide. That was what made him different. That was why she couldn't ignore the weight of this moment. The final conversation. Zira turned, walking back toward the shelter. Ethan glanced up from the fire. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes flickered with something he wouldn't say aloud. Zira sat down across from him, arms resting on her knees. For a while, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence. Then, finally, Ethan sighed. So, what's it gonna be? She looked at him, really looked at him. His face was rough from weeks of work, his hands calloused, his eyes tired but full of something steady. He had never been just surviving. Even on this ruined planet, even with no hope, he had always been living. And maybe that was why she had stayed so long. Zira exhaled. If I leave, what will you do? Ethan smirked, though there was no humor in it. What I always do. Keep building. Keep surviving. Zira narrowed her eyes. Alone. Ethan didn't answer right away. Then, finally, he shrugged. Guess so. The words hit harder than she expected. The idea of him sitting here, in the ruins, working on a shelter with no one to share it with. She didn't like it. She had been alone before. She knew what that felt like. And she wouldn't wish that on anyone. A decision made. Zira closed her eyes, listening to the fire, to the wind, to the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. She had always thought home was a place, a city, a ship, a return to what once was. But home wasn't where you were. It was who you were with. She opened her eyes. I am staying. Ethan blinked. What? She met his gaze, firm and unshaken. I am staying. For the first time, Ethan had no words. He stared at her, processing, as if he wasn't sure if she was serious. Then, slowly, a small, tired smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. "Well, Dan," he muttered, "guess I gotta finish the roof now." Zira smirked. "Yes, and I will make sure it does not collapse on your head." Ethan chuckled. "Now that's real teamwork. A future built together." The distress beacon still sat out there, silent and waiting. Maybe her people would return. Maybe a ship would come, searching for survivors. But if they did, she wouldn't be leaving. Not anymore. Because she had made her choice. Not to run. Not to survive. To live. To stay. To build a home with her own hands. And she wouldn't be building it alone.